the concept of mediation, because as a former UN officer, I stand by the UN Charter. Maybe some people think it's an old document. In this case, it's really old. This is my own example, my first actually, my first example of the Charter itself. But let's say that this for us and international relations is a sort of Bible. There are many Bibles, I know, but this is particularly useful when we talk about peaceful and pacific settlements of disputes that concern a chapter in the UN Charter, this chapter 6. This chapter 6 refers exactly to the peaceful or pacific settlements of disputes where parties in any given dispute may seek maintenance of peace and security through a negotiation, an inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, and other peaceful means. I wanted to say that because this is still a part of our portfolio in many ways. This is what we adopt in many circumstances. We go by that. Of course, if mediation or any other peaceful settlement solutions don't work, we go for other alternatives. And then you have also Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter that deals with more entrenched and more difficult situations. Now, when I thought of thinking of that, of this subject, I consider that, of course, we have many kind of mediations. You have direct, indirect mediations, you have negotiation processes, but they all tend to forge an agreement. There are processes that tend to forge an agreement. This is the whole purpose of mediation as such. Parliamentarians, I think parliamentarians are natural peace builders. Now this word peace builders is abused, but in reality is those who can induce peace, can help in crafting peace. Parliamentarians, because of their work in all the fora, in the legislative fora, and because of their role as representatives, promote positive peace. So we heard about the importance of not just ratifying a concept or ratifying an agreement, but make sure that this is applicable. So you may have formal or informal negotiations, and you may find different kind of mediations for mutually accepted solutions in crisis context. The network of parliamentarians that, Laurence, you are going to bring in, I mean, that you are going to establish as a sort of roster of experts, I think is a very, very important initiative. And the World Academy commends IPU for it, because it will have an effect also for preventive diplomacy in order to diffuse tensions in so many places, in so many areas, because of the essence of what parliamentarians represent. They represent people, essentially. So you, as being the expression of the people, are the right ones to represent concerns of people and make sure that positive peace is realized. Now, when we look into traditional international relations and conflict resolution, we know that we have traditional actors such as multilateral organizations. You have, of course, UN. You have regional organizations. You have the EU, African Union, and so on. But you also have civil society. You have a lot of civil society organizations now on the ground that act as peace builders, and the local actors. So it's not only at the international level, it's also at local actors. So this kind of public diplomacy that where parliamentarians are the natural linchpin is on the rise. and has an impact on civil society. This is, as I said, part of the public diplomacy that includes also cultural diplomacy, scientific diplomacy, environmental diplomacy, and so on. But parliamentarians have a particular role in that. Harold Saunders, who was a former Secretary of State of the United States, former Assistant Secretary of State of the United States, said that there are certain things that only governments can do, negotiating binding agreements. But there are other things that citizens can do, and that is to change human relations, change perceptions and stereotypes. So this is extremely evocative, I think, as a phrase that underlines the difference of what are agreements between states and what are agreements also that reflect opinions and also realities on the ground. There are many different mediation styles, and we will go into that. Certainly important is to persuade and to carry influence in all negotiations, whether you have a conciliatory style or a more aggressive style. I want to tell you just an anecdote, a personal anecdote, by one of my mentors, or certainly a reference for me, that was Sir Brian Urquhart. Sir Brian Urquhart has been an Under-Secretary General for Political Affairs at the United Nations. I had the pleasure of meeting him when he was phasing out, and he said to me that a mediation team, ideally, should fit in one vehicle. I think he also said that it should fit in the back of a Volkswagen. But what he meant is that it should be a team that has clear ideas, that has a purpose, that works together, and that knows exactly what it wants to achieve. Negotiation processes can be very complex and may require a lot of dealings. Of course, when we talk about parliamentarians, we know the role when there are agreements that require approval on their side, where you have ratifications. Let's think about the SDGs, the COPs that have been mentioned, climate change, biodiversity convention, etc. But parliamentarians have a role also in so-called forgotten emergencies. Let's think about the UN appeals that traditionally with donors are taking place in capitals and in their assemblies. So let's go back to the concept of prevention. Prevention is not just traditional diplomacy, is not just a traditional diplomatic action, but it's also the expression of civil society in different areas, such as education, employment, health, and so on, the human security agenda that we were referring to. When we talk about mediation, and this is my specific subject now, we have to think about the importance of acting as a third party, and that requires the consent of the parties in any given dispute. So that can be formal or informal, but it's essential to consider that there has to be a consent. If this consent vanishes at some point or is not there from the very beginning, of course, it's sort of mission impossible. Mediation is a process that requires active listening, that requires particular ability to forge agreements, and that has to be accompanied and sometimes also have to resist foreign or external pressure or influence, because that can somehow help, but can also damage the attempt to resolve any given conflict. Now, let me give you, because I know that I don't have much time, what I call some tips in terms of effective mediations and golden rules that maybe in future we will explore more in depth with some of the parliamentarians that you will co-opt in your group. The first golden rule, I'm sure you agree with that, is impartiality. Impartiality means a lot in terms of your relation towards those you work with. Impartiality cannot be compromised at any stage. That does not mean neutrality. There is a nuance in there. Neutrality, is hard to observe when you have to uphold values, when you have to uphold principles, human rights principles. But on the other hand, impartiality, that is the important equidistance between parties, is something cannot be revoked at any time. If not, negotiations and mediations become irrelevant. Your role in a negotiation becomes irrelevant. The second golden rule is preparedness. Preparedness means that any mediator has to study his files, has to prepare in advance, has to consider the ideal strategy, what are the best alternatives, what are other alternatives at any given time, in any negotiation or in any kind of mediation. Again, let's not think about these mediations as sorting out major agreements. You may be involved in very localized agreements that are extremely important, where I see parliamentarians and their value particularly fitting. Another point that I think is very important is cultural sensitivity. Cultural sensitivity is a golden rule, even more nowadays, because that also corresponds to the principle of integrity, independence, gender balance. They all come along the same principle. I think I expressed the importance of consent before, but the consent means also having a genuine commitment to a negotiation or mediation process. If that doesn't happen, again, it won't be possible to go any farther. That means also that you have to be particularly careful to spoilers of any peace process, interferences. In certain cases, it might be even better to withdraw or to recess from any given negotiation rather than getting entangled in situations that do not have the consent of the parties to go on. Confidence building and confidence and building relations is also a very important point. And again, here I see parliamentarians very much involved in this particular role. Legitimacy and inclusivity, ownership, these are all other important principles in that. I want to give you now some concrete examples that you asked me to bring up of what that means. Impartiality. Let's go back in time, in history almost. It's my time that I've been very much involved in former Yugoslavia. Lord Carrington of the European Community at that time had a plan for former Yugoslavia in 1991. He had in mind to have 6 sovereign states. His attempt and the European Union attempt failed. Why that failed? Primarily because of the perceptions of lack of impartiality by some, and the fact that the European Union at that time was almost considered as an irritant element, an agent of suspicion by some of those involved. So that has to be considered. There was certainly no issue of impartiality from the part of the European Commission at that time, but the perception are more important than the substance, and that caused a breakup. Preparedness, I mentioned preparedness. I think that it's in one of the negotiations that I've been involved in, mediations I've been involved for in a country, I cannot name it because there are still some sensitivities about that, but it was in North Africa. There was a negotiation for the release of prisoners between 2 factions. And it was a failed attempt because at that time, the principal mediator, negotiator in our camp had prepared himself well. We were a team of mediators, but since we had a plan, but he didn't really consider the responses of the other part, at some point he switched off. And when you switch off, you lose your train of thoughts and you cannot conduct anymore your business. So again, preparedness means also to think through what the others are going to do or going to say. And we lost months and months in order to recover what was just a momentary lapse in a negotiation. Consent or lack of consent. In June of '92, we had this mission of the United Nations in former Yugoslavia called UNPROFOR, and I was a civilian affairs officer at the time, and the head of this mission, the civilian component, political component, was a gentleman from Ireland. Since we spoke about Ireland before, his name was Cedric Thornberry, and he was a skilled diplomat, and he negotiated a ceasefire for the reopening of the airport in Sarajevo during the war. Unfortunately, the ceasefire never held. That was, the purpose was principally to fly in humanitarian aid. But the fact is that this consent of the parties was simply not there. So you can have it for some time, but if you don't have it for long, then, as you said, you even have to withdraw. This was the case, for instance, of Sadako Ogata. Certainly you remember this name. She was the High Commissioner for Refugees at the time, and she had the major role in that particular situation of the mandate of the United Nations in former Yugoslavia. At some point, due to the fact that the consent of the parties was not there to operate on the ground, she decided to withdraw. It was a strategic approach in order to re-engage later on, but that was particularly important. Legitimacy. I think we have to think in terms of the level of representation. Often is a question, is a very important question. It was a very important question for us when we had the first direct talks in Laayoune in 1993, in July 1993, between the Frente Polisario and Morocco. That was extremely difficult to bring in negotiators at a table because there were some defectors from one party to the other, and people simply did not speak to one another. So we had to resume talks, not as direct talks, but as proximity talks. Nonetheless, that had some success, and due also to our cultural awareness, we managed to continue the discussion in presence of both delegations in front of a dish of couscous. And just to tell you that sometimes you have also to find some remedies and to be creative in order to continue the negotiation process. So there are many issues also and constraints and roadblocks. Eventually, I will tell you later if we have more time. I want to tell you that in most mediations and negotiations, the national sovereignty limitations or the perceived, again, sense of reduced national jurisdiction can be a cause for withdrawal from an agreement. This is one of the major causes of failure in many sense.